I had a weird relationship, not a weird relationship. I started, I guess, drinking and doing drugs really young and like out of peer pressure as well. I had explored a lot, like obviously just like the normal stuff, like a lot of stimulants before the age of even 18. But I decided when I was probably about 24, I think I was, when I decided to try psychedelics for the first time. I was really similar to you.
Hi, and welcome to Taboo with Mimi, the podcast that talks about anything and everything, really, that is taboo in this world. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll. No. But seriously, I go around the world because I'm a digital nomad and I interview people from different cultures and ask them about their taboos. Why? Because it's time to talk about them. Some things will hopefully make you think. Others will maybe gross you out. But most things will be something you can relate to. So there you have it. Welcome to Taboo with Mimi. Today I am here with a very special guest. She's like a double guest because she was a guest on my Creativa. Who are you, special guest?
My name is Jem. I am an Australian that met Mimi whilst in Bali. Who am I? I've been traveling for a long period of time, working and traveling as I go, but I finally landed back in Melbourne. So now I'm a South African born, Australian raised, and now back in Australia after a long period of time away.
What do you do, Jem?
I have what people call a portfolio career, where I apparently can't commit to anything. I tend to find projects and work on them. My background is purely based on like community operations, and I guess what you would call a niche is I really like to focus on social enterprises or people building businesses that are really focusing on doing good for people or the planet. So community and operations.
Amazing. Amazing. And you personally changed a little bit of your career because you were in fundraising for a long time.
Yeah, so I guess the foundation of my career was in venture capital or starting out in kind of corporate startups, corporate and then startups. And then I landed myself in venture capital and I was working there as a head of community for about 5 years. Capitalism is not the best friend for people and planet. That is where the shift has come from as I decided to step away from the larger corporations and stepped into more of a supporting of the smaller businesses that contribute positively to society.
What I'd like to start with is, I know this because we know each other. Throughout your career, you have worked with, what was it? Was it a foundation or was it a business that dealt with neurodiversity?
Yeah. So basically, one of my clients, when I was working under a community called the Brand Kind Community, what we do is we kind of support through branding for good. So we focus on making sure that every business gets the support that they deserve from like a corporate level, but at the price of we call it low bono. So we cut our costs and support them. And one of the clients that we had under this community was a company called Exceptional. And what they did was they are a recruitment agency for those neurodivergent individuals who are either looking for work, have struggled to find work, or struggled to keep a job due to the like different ways of thinking that traditional employment doesn't quite understand or hasn't catered for at this point.
And then I remember when we started talking about it, I was like, ooh, this must be taboo because I don't know anything about it. Like, I feel like today we're talking more about, and then I want you to help me with the terminology a little bit, because the way I go into it is, that is autism or ADHD, which is commonly known as attention deficit disorder or something like that. But I know that there is a right terminology and a right way to actually describe this, I'm going to say. Yeah. And then, so help us through it. Help me through it.
Okay, great. So I guess a neurodivergent individual would be one who has a neurodevelopment disorder that kind of changes the way you process information or you think about the way of the world or your approach to different tasks. And then there is obviously so much confusion as to what this actually means. A neurodivergent individual could be someone who has something, some people actually refer to anxiety as neurodivergence as well, but it can be across autism or the autism spectrum. and then ADHD, or what we used to know as ADD as well, which was attention deficit disorder. So there's kind of version A, which is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and then there's attention deficit disorder. And there's many other things that fall under neurodivergence, but the main kind of two that are focused in the mainstream media at the moment, what is becoming more commonly known in our society, is autism or ADHD.
Right. And when you say, because I've heard the phrasing, like a lot of people, I know a few people, because it has become, I think, more accepted to say that you are either on a spectrum. That's the terminology that I've heard. Oh, I'm on a spectrum, which usually means you have some form of autism. And then people are looking more into ADHD. But I was reading a little bit about it also leading up to this. And especially when it comes to women, there is very little information out there about ADHD in general. It's usually not diagnosed for a very long time. And then people just find out about it later in life.
Yeah. A really important point that has to be made is the fact that women, we actually don't get diagnosed at an early stage, because what happened was, when we were younger, doctors or scientists generally defined ADHD as attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And what that meant was, obviously, young boys tend to express themselves in a different way to young females. And obviously, times are changing, we're becoming more aware. And as we become more aware, we actually realize that women, or girls, as we speak of them now, they have a hyperactivity and a different mindset. So the way they express it is overthinking, or they find coping mechanisms, but their version of hyperactivity is actually within their mindset. So they're often finding ways to cope with the way that their brain works in an alternative way. And it's more common than we think. And we can probably see what you were saying. People are more commonly saying, like, I'm neurodivergent. Usually that means that they've either been diagnosed with ADHD, or they've seen a psychologist who's supporting them through that process. And what it does is it helps them manage the way that they've perceived life to be. Has been quite challenging for some, but they've just seen it as it's just their way of living. And now we're starting to see that there are actually structures in place, or sometimes at times medication, that they can take to support them in looking towards more of a strengths-based model, rather than looking at neurodivergent as a deficit, which is what we perceived it to be as when we were younger. So it's a really exciting time, because things are happening in a really fast-paced manner as well.
Yeah, and I think anything that happens to the mind is really, because I feel like we don't know much about it. Our brains are so interesting, but if we think about any other disorder, I'm just going to say, to encompass all of the things that we think about, bipolarism or anything like that, they're all seen by society as something negative. I know so many people that are on a spectrum and they're incredibly good at something, and I know so many people that are geniuses, and then when you, or however you define genius, but when you see especially those people that are coding, and here in Bali you see so many developers, they have a hyper ADHD and they know it, and they're
so you've probably grown up with someone who's really honed in and quite commonly has these micro obsessions, and they'll zone in 150% on that micro obsession, and they'll become almost like an expert in this tiny little thing that we didn't even think to know about. A really good example is someone that I know. She has autism, and she's very open about it with her friends and family. But we go to trivia, and she discovered that she didn't know much about the flags of the world. So for about 3 months, she committed to discovering exactly every single country and what their flags look like. For 3 months, just 100%. And now she has this intense knowledge about flags. But I might have gone on a little tangent there. But another good example is my brother. He is a neurodivergent individual, and he in school really struggled. But what we actually found once he left school and realized that he could actually study the things that he wanted to study, all of a sudden you can't get his head out of a book. You cannot get him to stop researching and understanding every minute detail about the things that he's extremely passionate about. And I can honestly say he's the smartest person that I know. But when he was in school, he just wasn't interested, and his brain did not work in the same way that they were expecting him to do it. And life was just that much more difficult for him, because he was being told the way he needs to learn, rather than just being given the tools to learn in the way that his brain works.
Yeah. And I think that's like super important because my mom is a teacher and I've always seen her really not struggling, but saying like how important it was is there are some people that work differently. There you can just tell their brain doesn't work in what we call the traditional way, and they need some different type of learning. And it's not right or wrong, it's just they need different because as you said, their brain works in a different way. And I feel like our education, and because we also maybe don't talk about it enough, we don't do enough to like provide more inclusivity. I've read so many things because I'm really interested in ADHD. And there is one person on Instagram, a woman, I think she's 26, and she just got diagnosed with ADHD. And I've known that was like something for a very, very long time, but I was just like, no one ever knew what to tell me because there is very little research. If you're a woman, there's even less. And she was like, I just found out, and these are the symptoms. And while I was like reading the symptoms, oh, I can recognize some of those.
That's exactly why it's so hard for us. But during this time that I was working with this particular client, like I was doing a lot of case studies under their kind of comms strategy. And there were women who were like 39 running businesses, like they were being diagnosed at 39, or like on the flip side, their children were being diagnosed. This is actually becoming super common where they're taking their children to be diagnosed, and the psychologist is actually turning around and saying, have you or your partner been tested? Because it is quite commonly passed down, even though like there's no research and there's no proof. It is very common for a parent to have it as well as the child. So now what's the psychologists are doing, before they used to focus only on the child, they're actually turning around and saying, would you like to be like assessed? And oftentimes that's what happens. But one of the things that I was facing, and I'm continuing to face in my social group as well, is I'm having friends who are being diagnosed now whilst they're in their full careers, like 10 to 15 years into their careers. And what they're finding is they're really struggling with the reintegration into their jobs after understanding the knowledge of the way that their brain is processing and thinking, and then also trying to get back into their role. And there's just not enough support in the transition process as well, like the corporate structure and like the structure of the businesses that are currently funding employment. They don't have the policies or the structures in place to support adults going through such an intense time. So when you look at traditional school models, the way that they understood it, they took you in and treated you quite special or almost like different. And that separated you, but that's not the way that we should be doing it. It should be quite an inclusive, over communicated process. And it also has to be consensual as well. And that's like the flip side of it is, are people comfortable talking about it? Have we made it so comfortable in society now that people are comfortable saying it out loud or putting it up on Instagram, like that woman that you saw? But how comfortable are people to actually sit down with their HR managers and say, I've just been diagnosed with ADHD, or I've just found out I'm on the spectrum in some way? And how do we have those conversations? And then how do we communicate that with our team that we're working with on a day-to-day basis as well? So it's a bit difficult at the moment because we're at the peak going up.
Do you know how does the testing works? I guess it depends on the country as well.
Yeah, I can speak for Australia, but I do know that it's an incredibly difficult process. And by difficult, financially, you can skip the process. In Australia, for example, and I assume in many other places of the world, you have to begin by taking like a psychology test or some sort of test with a doctor to then get a referral to a psychologist. The doctor has to have some sort of inkling that you need to be assessed. You can take some tests online, but I wouldn't recommend them because 9 times out of 10, it's probably going to give you a 90 percentile, but you're definitely going to have some sort of neurodivergent traits because that is who we are as human beings. We all have different brains. But then you would go into your first assessment with a psychologist. These processes can cost upwards of 3,000 Australian dollars. So wow. It is quite a socio-economical issue as well. The accessibility for these tests are not easy. And then what we have after that is you have your first assessment. The psychologist then deems you to require further testing. And usually they will have a general understanding as to, my belief and my understanding is that you don't go through to that second phase unless they have the higher level of understanding and they just want to assess the severity of the situation. So understanding if the individual would require medication or kind of some sort of intervention or support in how to restructure or re-understand. I don't want to say restructure because you're not restructuring your whole life, but unlearning the things that you've taught yourself to cope, and then moving forward, understanding what the new normal could look like if you choose to take part in those kind of alternative activities that are different to your conventional life that you've been living.
What do you think is taboo?
Under the umbrella of neurodivergence in general, we're thinking ADHD, we're thinking autism, we're thinking dyslexia as well. So when we didn't have much research or information in the background, like in the early 2000s, earlier, when this started becoming something, a lot of society would keep this under wraps. We didn't want to have these conversations because it made it seem like we were different or not normal, or what we refer to as normal. So you'd often hear someone called, say, atypical, neurotypical. So that is commonly known. So you're either neurodivergent or neurotypical. I don't actually assign to either of those categories, but that is the conversation. And it's quite ostracizing, like at times, to have that label placed on you, especially in school, as what people are like around school. But I wouldn't say that it's not taboo in a sense that it's becoming more of a topic of conversation and people are starting to feel more comfortable. But that is also to be said that these are the communities that we're probably surrounding ourselves with as well. As we get older, people are more likely to speak about the things they're struggling with. And that is the power of living in this generation. But in the generations before us, this was even parents having their children diagnosed with ADHD or autism. It was what they perceived to be something that was going to be that child's struggle for the rest of its life. And now we're perceiving it as something that we can hopefully move forward and look at it with a strengths-based approach. So looking at their superpowers, especially with children, trying to teach them what their superpowers are and in terms of the way they process information and move forward. But yeah, it's very much a generational thing and something that we have to continue the conversation for, because obviously the access when it comes to socioeconomic circumstances is a bit more of something that I guess we have to have that conversation.
Yeah. In terms of terminology, because I remember we talked about it, you said there are like some ways to describe neurodivergent people. I would say more like terms or wording that are more, I don't know, I want to say fair or more accepted by neurodivergent people than others. Would you say so?
Yeah, I used to say those experiencing life with neurodivergence, but it actually, the right terminology is a neurodivergent individual or someone who is neurodivergent. Because those experiencing life with neurodivergent makes it sound like it's a symptom or it's like a disorder. And even now, whilst it's like under a attention deficit disorder, we don't perceive it to be something that is, what's the word? It's not a negative in any way, shape or form when it comes to our brains, but a disorder leans the terminology towards that way. But yeah, so it's a neurodivergent individual, not those experiencing neurodivergence.
Yeah. And then from there is all the categories that we talked about. Do you think, this might be a big question, you might not know the answer, but do you think it can also happen as a result of drugs, for example?
No, I don't believe so. I don't actually, it's a really good question because I'm not a scientist, so I do not know, but it is a neurodevelopmental disorder. And I have not done the research, so I cannot help you there, but it's about the unique structure and chemistry within our brains. So it's, the jury is out. I've never actually thought about that. That's a really good question. But I like to think that it's not, but yeah, I haven't looked into it.
Yeah, fair.
I'm definitely going to research this after this thing.
No, because I have one friend that went through college she was during college and she decided to experience a lot of psychedelics, for example. And after that, and maybe she already had it and then just something happened, but after 2 years, so 2 years of like experiences with different type of drugs, she had a seizure, I think. And after that seizures, she started having more and more obsessions. So maybe what we think is that she probably had them before and then somehow they got amplified. Different things have to be like drugs. Maybe it was just like stress as well. It was like where she was in her life or so many different things. But I remember that the conversation around it was is that like, oh, this is what happens as an aftermath of drugs, which we probably wasn't. She probably had it before as well. We just wasn't like diagnosed because she never looked into it. But yeah, I like how we usually like try to deal with like taboo topics with other taboo topics as well. Like it was probably not that, it's that, but still we're not going to talk about it. And that's it. We wouldn't tackle like the whole thing. It was just she wasn't ready to talk about it. And so we would just like completely ignore it. We wouldn't even bring it up because for her, it was like, you could see it, like she was like really embarrassed. And yeah, that was a very interesting experience. And at times I remember I felt so bad about it because it's like, you shouldn't be embarrassed to talk about all these things, and especially in your good friends group. And it was definitely the elephant in the room.
Yeah. Is she okay now?
She's stable. Yeah.
Amazing.
That's how she says she is, because she always says I'm stable, but she still doesn't really talk about it.
Yeah. There is like a connection between those that are neurodivergent and those that tend to use some form of either stimulant or suppressant to support them if they aren't diagnosed. There has been obviously not substantial evidence because we haven't gone down that rabbit hole just yet. We're still working through it. But from what I have read, there is quite a higher, I guess, cadence of people in their late teens to early 20s who tend to use psychedelics or marijuana, for example, to calm their thoughts and their minds. But yeah, it's very similar as well, like the way you were talking about your friend who it was the elephant in the room. And oftentimes, if someone doesn't feel comfortable sharing that they are neurodivergent, at times they can actually be a bit of an elephant in the room as well. It's almost like everyone knows, but no one wants to talk about it. And I've definitely experienced that with a number of people as well. And people call them quirky, or they're a little bit different, or there's all of these endearing words for them. But yeah, it's interesting how society tends to suppress things. We're aware, but we suppress. And it's a very interesting process.
Yeah, from your own experience, and then I'm going to ask you another question. But to close this up, from your experience, what is the best way to approach, let's say like you have a friend that comes to you and says, hey, I'm a neurodivergent individual. What would you say is the right way to support these kind of people?
I think that you would be a great person to go to. I think that what we all need to be aware of is like the level, like, and this is such a big one, but if someone comes to you and says, I've just been diagnosed, and they're obviously opening the discussion for you, I think the first thing would be, do you want to talk about it? Do you have concerns, or do you have anxieties around this? Is there a reason why you're coming to me? Or would you like to work together and see if we can find some resources or something to help support you through this process? Obviously acknowledging the fact that if you aren't educated in this field, then really guiding them towards like, how can we do this together if that's what you're looking for? Because at the end of the day, there's so many different avenues that you could go down in terms of supporting a friend. But the number one thing I think is just like listening to them and what their experience is, and then going from there. Because at the end of the day, there's resources that you can get. And obviously, I would love to point you in the direction of one of my clients because they're great. Whilst they're a recruitment agency, and they tend to help find jobs for neurodivergent individuals, they also have a lot of resources on their website, and also they've got over 20 years of experience in just this one field, despite the fact that it wasn't a very common field to be in during that time. There are many around the world. It's just about finding the right support system for you. And there's unfortunately a lot more neurodivergent individuals than there are jobs willing to actively take on. Obviously, neurodivergent individuals can get jobs no matter where they go, but with the level of understanding and support in specific companies, because the company that I was working for also helps train their HR teams or the person who would be supporting the neurodivergent individual going into that job as well. But yeah, that would be my number one piece of advice, is just listening and understanding why they're coming to you, and then working together if that's what they're interested in, but really being just a friend and an ear with the knowledge that you don't have all the answers.
Yeah. I've just remembered something very interesting. Last year, I was with some friends in Lisbon, and there is just one guy from the group who has ADHD at a very high level. He takes medications for it. He sent me a message saying, hey, Mimi, I think you are on a spectrum and that you should do some tests about it. And
Oh,
I got so offended. And then it got me really thinking, like, why did I get offended? Maybe it is true. But I remember like getting that message and feeling so offended by it. And I think this is interesting because that says a lot about the way
yeah.
we look at it.
But it also says a lot about the way he communicated, because I think it's
True.
also like something so special about, obviously we have so many different types of people in this world, and the way we're used to people skipping around that elephant in the room, like he very well could have, that could have been the biggest compliment in the world, because obviously he is a neurodivergent person, and to him there's absolutely nothing wrong. That is what like his normal is, and this is the thing, we all have different versions of normal. So it could have been like a really kind gesture on his part saying, hey, you're one of us, like come join the crowd. But at the same time, like exactly what you said, like there's that taboo nature where it's like, oh, not me, like I'm atypical, like I've lived life, like I've never had any issues. And it's really interesting the way that we can put ourselves into a box, and then when we start looking at these other traits of this other kind of circle over here, you start really thinking, oh, maybe I'm not only in this one box, and there's so much more of life that can be explored as well. Even if you aren't on any spectrum and you are completely atypical, which is very unlikely, it just, I don't know, it's a little bit of a flavor. But I do believe that he probably saw it as something, as a kindness. And yeah, you are right. It is that big question mark.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think, and then I'm interested to know what you think as well. I think that somehow I started exploring with my mind a little bit more when I
Mm,
started exploring with drugs. And I think
mm-hmm,
like there's like something obscure about our minds, interesting and dark. Like that's the way I see
mm-hmm.
it. We know so little about our minds, but yet we're so fascinated by it that for me, like I started exploring really. I feel like the main reason why I started exploring with Alex, for example, was like because I wanted
Mm-hmm.
to get access to the deeper levels of my mind and kind of like I don't want to glorify drugs. I'm like not here for this, but I'm just like I just wanted to. I was curious to know what are the layers of it. Does that
Just
resonate?
on your,
Or
yeah, I was going to say on your point about glorifying drugs, I'm going to glorify drugs, because I think that going into using psychedelics and sometimes stimulants as well with intentionality and respect, like utmost respect for the drug that you're like using, and going in knowing what your intention is and understanding what parts of your mind you'd like to understand a bit better, I do think that we have access to something so much more than what we're capable of without the stimulant or like the psychedelic that would take us there. It's not to say that meditation or breath work can't do the same thing. I truly believe in the power of breath work. But at the same time, I do think that we can go much deeper as long as we have the respect for whatever drug that we're putting into our bodies, and understanding of how much we can take as like human beings. Some people will just be like, oh, I'm just going to take this full vial of whatever it is, and it may not, or it may or may not be something that your body can handle. So it's all about just like taking baby steps with understanding education and kind of knowing that you're supported by someone as well, like someone is close by, someone knows what you're doing. And I think that you have the ability to access so much more if you go in with complete intentionality. So I will glorify them. Sorry.
no, that's fine. For me, it was just like I exactly what you said. I feel like a lot of people go in it without having a respect or knowledge about it.
Mm,
I have fully like educated myself before, and I'm just gonna say my first drug that I ever took in my life was LSD. So because it was like either go
mm.
big or go home. I've never
Yeah,
done
I was
anything
going to say
before,
that's
but yes, a
that's
lot of
such an
people do not
interesting one to start with.
recommend. A lot of people were like, "Are you sure first drug ever LSD?" And I'm like, "Yes, yeah, I'm ready
And
for
I
it."
remember it was quite late as well for you, wasn't it? It was
Oh
like
yeah,
in your
yeah,
late 20s.
yeah. It was like 29.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah, because I was like before 30, I want to try at least one drug. And for me,
Mm,
I chose psychedelics because I read so much about it, and I was like, yeah, I feel I. My best friend was like, yes, let's. One of my best friends was like, yes, let's do it together. I was in a place that I was like feeling safe and with a person that I was feeling safe with. And I felt like even it's a 12-hour trip, I felt like exactly what I said before. I felt like I wanted to go deeper. And I felt like I had done my research. I knew it was an addictive, for example, which is one of the things that scared me the most specifically.
Yeah.
It wasn't going to give me a calm down like other drugs, MDMA does, for example, which I've later experienced as well. But that's a totally different feeling because it's not a psychedelics. So I was like, and it also gives you visuals. And I was like really excited to know this. But as I said, I went in, I tried it for the first time when I was 29 after doing a lot of research, and I was safe. I was with a safe person and stuff like that. So for me, it just made sense. But I don't want to say this for everybody because maybe it's not.
Yeah.
But I would love to know your experience.
Yeah. I had a weird relationship. Not a weird relationship. I started, I guess, drinking and doing drugs really young and like out of peer pressure as well. I had explored a lot, like obviously just like the normal stuff, like a lot of stimulants before the age of even 18. But I decided when I was probably about 24, I think I was, when I decided to try psychedelics for the first time. I was really similar to you. I was so scared of them. And my younger brother actually really enjoyed using psychedelics. And like his stories used to scare me a little bit, but we came a bit closer and we started talking about it a bit more. And then a partner at the time as well on my birthday, we went camping and I tried LSD for the first time. And going into it, like I was so prepared. I'd spoken to my younger brother who was very well versed in it. And he was like, go in with a mantra and just know it's always going to be okay as long as you can pull yourself into that mantra. Like every time you start feeling any darkness or dark thoughts coming. And mine was open heart, open mind. So I really focused on just making sure that like whenever something was pulling me into a negative experience, I would then just refer to open heart, open mind, and it would pull me straight back. And ever since then, I've gone quite deep and I've sat in ceremony with psilocybin and also obviously LSD. And then I've been working with some of the plant medicines in South America as well. And whenever I've done that, I've always gone in with a mantra reminding me of what my intention was. It's not always been open heart, open mind, but it has always been something that will pull me back to my physical body and also my intention around why I'm using it. But I genuinely believe that psychedelics not only saved my life, but it's healed my relationships with people who are very close to me and those that are really close to me. I'm going to just tell you this story. My mum struggled a lot with anxiety growing up. We had a life experience at one point, and yeah, she had struggles with anxiety. And we went a really long couple of years, almost a decade, of a strained relationship because of her anxiety projecting onto myself and my brother. And one day I just sat down with her and I was like, it's just too much now. Like, we have something to talk to you about, but you have to come into it with an open mind. And we'd been trickling in little kind of stories along the way. Like, we gave her a book called A Really Good Day, probably about 3 years prior. And it was about a woman who was in her late 30s who decided to microdose LSD because she hated her life. She had kids, she had a business, all of that. So my mum had read that book already, but eventually we sat down, convinced her to try microdosing. And I can honestly say that the change in her anxiety levels has changed phenomenally. Like, she is such a strong woman now, and she always was strong, but sometimes her anxiety got the best of her. And she's also gotten a couple of her friends who struggled with addiction onto microdosing psilocybin as well. And they have also not conquered their addictions to alcohol, but have severely decreased the cadence of which they're drinking. Obviously, they don't drink every night anymore. And so I've seen the positives of psilocybin across generations. And I'm a huge proponent of it. If you're feeling like you're at your wit's end and you just need something, I truly believe that researching and respecting what you're using and understanding the reason as to why you're doing it can change your perspective on so many things.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting because, for example, a friend of mine, she does microdosing of mushrooms to help. She has like very bad PMSing, which is premenstrual symptoms, and she has very bad cramps during her menstruations and her cycle, and microdosing mushrooms really helps her.
That's so beautiful that she found that.
Yeah, and I know another person who had severe depression, and microdosing with mushroom really, really helped her. And I think it's really interesting because somehow alcohol, which I'm not going to lie, I do enjoy sometimes, is actually just really bad for you. And it's completely, fully legal in 90% of the world,
Yeah.
basically. And we can access this, which we can overdo it. We can do so many things and with it, and it's totally legal and accepted. And other forms of medicine somehow, because sometimes it is. I love how, for example, I've had a friend who had a beautiful mushroom journey, a shaman from South America that called it a medicine. Like a lot of people in America, for example, call mushroom experiences and mushroom ceremonies as medicine. And I think it's really interesting because it's a lot about perspective and who won and who decides what's okay, what's not okay for us, and what is legal, what is illegal, like all these like things, which I think is just really interesting. And
just last year we had a massive movement for psilocybin, MDMA, and LSD to be used in clinical trials, and also ketamine to be used in clinical trials for mental health. So we have a organization over here in Australia called the Mind Medicine Australia, and what they're doing is trying to legalize and get political, how do you describe it? Legislation to support psychedelics and some sort of plant medicines to be used as clinical support for those experiencing severe depression. So yeah, there's big moves happening in the world right now.
Yeah. And I think the story of your mom, and thank you for sharing that. It's such a personal story. That's so beautiful. And I was like thinking about something interesting. And I wonder what you think about that, because one of my best friends is very much into drugs and she just loves them. And I think for her, because she has so much anxiety and control, she needs to have this perpetuous like control over her life. And for her, doing drugs is a way to break free from that anxiety, from that control that she has constantly in her life. Whether for me, it's interesting, like every single drug trip that I had was bad. I always had like an initial part that was like super beautiful. I feel like this super strong connection. And it's funny that you said the mantra, because I always have a mantra every time I do drugs and I feel like a little bit what's going on. I go back to my mantra, which is just sitting down. This is a trip. This is not reality. This is just a trip. You can calm down. Like everything that you're experiencing right now is not your reality. And that really helps me to calm down, to actually see the world from this perspective. And that helps me calm down. But it's really interesting because I see people around me. I see, for example, her, she enjoys it and she has these beautiful experiences every time. For me, I have an experience that is super strong and amazing for the first part. And then anxiety starts to kick in and I have this huge anxiety that just like weighs on me. And it's interesting because I'm not a person that is obsessive about control. My purpose is not to break free from that anxiety or from that control, because I'm okay in real life. And it's interesting because, and I don't want to like saying okay in real life is not right. I don't have that in my life. So I feel like when I am doing drugs, I'm looking for something different. And when I feel like I'm losing control, it's not, oh my God, I'm finally losing control, but it's, oh fuck, I'm losing control. And that triggers the anxiety.
I think the really interesting thing that you said about your friend is like, it's like the two extremes, like extreme control and then just releasing control, like relinquishing control. And I think there was a time when I was similar to your friend. I just used to, back when I was younger, drugs were an escape. They were like, alcohol was an escape. I don't really drink anymore at all because like I don't like what it does to my body. But it's interesting, those two extremes. And I don't know if you're familiar with Vipassana. Yeah. And like the teaching that they have is like living life without craving or aversion, like finding that extreme point of balance. And it's almost like you were just saying, you live in kind of a balanced lifestyle at the moment. So you may not be searching for something else. You might go in with intention, but you're not like leaping bounds because you know that you've got that balance in your life as well. So there is a piece of that, like it's like going one way or the other can sometimes be like healing in certain instances, but there's also, you always got to find that middle point of balance as well.
Yeah, for sure. Last question. Wow, it's crazy how time flies every time I do this. But my last question for you is, and I always ask this question because I feel like people answer in so many different ways. What did you wish people understood that they don't? It's a very broad question.
It is. And there's so many things. There's so many things. But I also know I'm going to flip that on myself from 10 years ago. I really wish that I understood more about psychedelics and the power of psychedelics to work through like really big things in your life, like big decisions or like heavy bouts of depression or severe anxiety. If I had understood that 10 years ago, or if I could have helped just one person through something that they were going through in their life with an understanding of how to do that with psychedelics, I think that life would have been a lot easier 10 years ago versus the trials and tribulations that I had to go through the past decade. But yeah, I unfortunately, actually not fortunate. No, it's fortunate. I love the journey that I had to go on because I feel like I learned so much about it. I learned more than I should have because I had to do more research. But yeah, that is 100% what I would say is just the power of plant medicine is huge, and it can change and save you.
Beautiful. Jem, thank you so much for talking about this very taboo topics, actually. It's important that we talk about these things. And yeah, thank you for being brave. Thank you so much. And is there anything you want to add?
I think I'm just super grateful for not only like the opportunity to talk about things with you, like also the level of comfort that I had talking about these things with you and the other females that were with us at Creativa as well. Like a lot of those conversations have guided me to where I am today. So that's what I'm super grateful for at this point is like my life is going in this pivotal direction, and all these things that we discussed and everything that I'm working towards at the moment it's a really great place to be at. And my time in Bali with you was definitely a pivotal moment.
Yeah, I love that. And I love the fact that we openly talked about really anything. And I remember there was one of us that was scared to talk about it. I don't know if anyone is going to judge me for this, but I'm going to talk about drugs. And we all respect to like her and her journey and everything. I think it's actually really important to be surrounded and be in a space where you can really talk about anything, whether it is drugs or what you're going through your mind, and create spaces and community.
Yeah. And we even had people from all ends of the spectrum. We had people who were like, oh, we're not cool enough to touch that. And then we had other people who were like quite well versed. So we had so many different walks of life coming in and like weighing in on a certain circumstance that she was experiencing. And it was both positive and negative. It was trying to understand what this meant to her in her world, because she was going through a positive experience, but it was also having negative implications. And you had all these like women just being able to weigh in on their own life experiences. That's a very unique environment to be in, especially during like situations like that. So it was a beautiful experience.
Yeah, but I also think in general, it's just sometimes you have something you struggle with and you don't think you can talk about it because maybe you're scared people will judge you. Maybe you're scared people will think of you in a different way. Maybe. And then sometimes what happens is as soon as you start talking about it, right on, let's like we all talked about our experiences. I was like, yes, we're just waiting for this because the interesting thing about taboo topics, it's not just taboo for you, it's taboo for a lot of people. And the second you break the taboo, you give permission to other people to break the taboo as well.
Exactly. I love it.
And to everyone else, I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.